Welcome back to Every Doctor Who Ever. Today we are talking about Season 3 of Classic Doctor Who. When last we left off, we had been introduced to basically a new set of companions, as the previous ones that had basically started the franchise with had all left by that point by the end of Season 2. A very similar thing will happen in Season 3 as we get to the end of the William Hartnell era, as the ones began in this season will be gone by the end of it, and we'll have basically a big cast change by the end of it, which will more or less become like a regular thing over time. But more importantly, not just cast changes, but crew changes as well, as Season 3 is a very tumultuous season where lots of changes start to happen, and a lot of them that aren't really favorable to a lot of the people working on the show currently. With our producer still being Verity Lambert, still trying her best to keep the show to be even slightly educational, the current script editor is Daniel Tosh, who at this point is trying his best to make any kind of sci-fi show at all. We begin Season 3 with Galaxy 4. With only one surviving episode, it is the earliest non-historical to have missing episodes. Ultimately, until 2011, it was part of the longest gap of episodes there was in the whole series for quite a bit, ultimately finally being found just kind of almost randomly, but at the very least there are lots of pretty good telesnaps that do a good job telling the story, alongside an animated recreation that was made in more recent times, which does a pretty good job. Now, of course, what is the plot of Galaxy 4? Oh, wait, is that footage of the Daleks again? That's right, Galaxy 4, like other stories in this time, is very much the Daleks. The Doctor and friends meet up with the Dravins, who of course are these regular human-looking people. They are a little bit suspicious, but certainly they're not the bad guys of this piece. It must be the weird creatures that apparently shot the Dravins down, them known as the Rills, who are using these weird little robots. What are they called? Well, Vickie calls them the Chumbleys, and after Vickie calls them the Chumbleys, they just are the Chumbleys now. Like, Vickie, stop trying to make Chumbleys a thing. It's not a thing, and it won't be a thing. The Chumbleys are once again other attempts to make some kind of new iconic sci-fi thing in order so that they could just replace the Dalek with them, but of course, you know, it's no deal. I do love the Chumbleys. They're so goofy as shit. And the Rills, who of course are the actual good guys, who of course were actually shot down by the Dravins. Now, of course, you know, it could just be two groups lying to them, but one is very suspicious and is just like, you know, clearly evil, and the other one is the Rills, who even though they look like monsters are of course just pretty chill. Obviously, this is meant to be a big twist in the storyline, which you're supposed to be surprised at. Well, not only does it do a piss-poor job at making you think these guys actually are evil, but also, newspapers during the time literally spoiled the whole twist of the storyline. So even people at the time knew that the Dravins were gonna be the bad guys. Ultimately, they were revealed very quickly in the storyline to be the bad guys, and, you know, then they just kind of start just, you know, threatening the Doctor and friends to try to get them off the planet before it explodes, and not the Rills. When ultimately, you know, they could have just worked together to fix both of their ships and gotten off this planet. By the end, the Rills are helped, and the Dravins are left in this destroyed planet, and the Doctor and friends are able to get back to their TARDIS and get the right out of there. This serial was supposed to conclude Season 2, but as other times in this franchise was kept over for the next season to give them a little bit more time. Ultimately, I feel like this probably wouldn't have been the best story to end a season with, but it is a fun one. It does at the very least feel quite a bit different than the, like, good chunk of the rest of this series, as this was the last major storyline to go under Verity Lambert. Now, ultimately, Verity Lambert would go on to produce one more episode, but we'll talk about that one later, because it's kind of part of a different storyline that is, of course, under the next producer. Galaxy 4 is a pretty fun storyline, I think. It's a basic sci-fi, cheesy plot about aliens, but it's a fun one nonetheless. If you're looking for high art in any capacity, you're not going to find that with Galaxy 4. It's not a good storyline. But holy shit, is it fun? It's a wacky little sci-fi time, and I have a lot of fun with it. I love the Chumbleys. They're so goddamn funny. Peter Purves, who of course plays Stephen Taylor, does not enjoy this storyline, as ultimately, as you'll find out throughout the rest of this season, Peter Purves doesn't like these storylines of which he isn't the coolest guy throughout the whole story. He has said multiple times the fact that he doesn't like it because the storyline seemingly, quote, feminized Stephen Taylor, because ultimately this was written with the idea that Ian and Barbara were there, which means after they were cut, he was given both of their lines. Which of course means he was given Ian's lines, and easily a lot of the moments that he finds which feminized him probably were actually Ian doing stuff, but okay, whatever. I, in fact, would recommend Galaxy 4, and I'd actually recommend the animated version. I think it does a pretty good job replicating what was there in its original format. I also think it's kind of fun to see the fact that the Dravens are made to be taller in the animated version. As the real recording block of Season 3 began, new producer John Wiles would come on and ultimately begin the Mythmakers. This, of course, would be the end of the time of Verity Lambert. Now, Verity Lambert's career would certainly continue afterwards, after Doctor Who. Verity Lambert for another few years would continue working with the BBC, ending point of the 70s would work under freelance, but ultimately would begin in 1974 working in Thames Television and Euston Films, and would find immense success, both critically and financially. Helping win multiple BAFTAs for some great productions under that company, she would work in that company until 1985, where ultimately she would help find her own company, Cinema Verity, which would be incredibly successful and produce lots of films that, in fact, the people watching might actually know if you're from not Britain. Though certainly going her own way, she would work on the occasion with the BBC, and even in the early 90s tried to get the rights to produce Doctor Who independently when ultimately the series went dark. She would have a storied career of multiple movies that she would help produce, and of course and even by the point of 2002 was appointed Officer for the Order of the British Empire for her services in film and television production. A fantastic and caring woman who ultimately really helped to break the boundaries in terms of production of film, and of course is one of the most important people in terms of making our favorite franchise exist, even still till today. The series would continue on without her, ultimately beginning with The Mythmakers. The Mythmakers is a storyline with all of its episodes missing, written by Donald Cotton, who would later, of course, write The Gunfighters and both of their novelizations. The Mythmakers is another historical story, and it's not my favorite. In fact, I don't have much to really say about The Mythmakers. The Mythmakers is mostly the characters finding themselves during the Trojan War, a period of history of which people don't quite know too much about, because a lot of that information is mostly mythologized, or of course, was either destroyed, lost, or destroyed in some different way. It is another one of those stories of which ultimately the characters are just accused by some character during the story to be like, oh, they're a spy because I don't know them, and that's why we have to kill them right now, and they won't listen to anything they're saying, they're always lying. And that's that for a chunk of it. Of course, for at least the Doctor and Stephen, they're kind of, it makes sense, as after the Doctor walks out of the TARDIS when the warrior Achilles is about to kill a Trojan, the Doctor begins to pretend that he's Zeus. Until ultimately Stephen kind of fumbles it a bit, so now they're forced to help them fight against the Trojans. It is in fact the Doctor that helps inspire them create the Trojan horse, which is kind of funny, to be honest. But as they're being, forced to do that, the TARDIS is found by the Trojans themselves, and then that whole thing happens with the priestess Cassandra, who is just like, hey, let's not trust this random lady who just verbatim said she was from the future. Of course, she ends up being right, which is just kind of funny, because it's one of the only times that they were actually right, and that them being here is a bad idea. Though, the more important part about the Mythmakers is the fact that Vickie meets Troyes. Troyes, a Trojan warrior, ultimately ends up being the person that she falls in love with. The two immediately fall in love, and I don't really care too much for it. I don't really see it at all. At the very least, I saw what was happening there with the Daleks invade London, and, it still wasn't the, best written relationship, but it at least had more of it there than here, of which it just feels very sudden. Vickie, because she obviously knows what's happening, tells Troyes to go look on the outside of the village for Stephen, who at this point had decided to get himself, trapped by the Trojans themselves, and she pretends that he seemingly escaped and he must be found. Obviously, of course, this is all to make sure that he's out of the, city grounds for when the Trojan horse is brought in, and a bunch of the Grecians are able to go and attack Troy. Again, this did not happen in real life, but, what are you gonna do? The Doctor, with help of one of the priestess Cassandra's handmaidens, which is Katerina, is able to find the mildly injured Stephen, because P.S. Stephen fights two separate warriors, and they bring him in the TARDIS and leave. Stephen is very confused, but ultimately the Doctor did have a very small conversation, partially off-screen with Vickie, where she basically tells him that she wants to stay because she's fallen in love with Troyes. She's able to escape this big siege and finds Troyes out there in the fields, as they're then met by Troyes' like cousin, and they're able to escape without being absolutely murdered. Before we get to that, The Mythmakers on its own is kind of okay. It's another pure historical, not much is really there. They actually are part of the plot this time, and it's a little bit more enjoyable because it has much better dialogue, certainly, but it is still a storyline with two separate people accusing the main characters of being spies with absolutely zero proof, and that's never not annoying in this series. The Mythmakers, though, is 4 parts, and even though most of it isn't existing, it isn't that bad of a watch. It also is required viewing, because of the fact that Vickie, a character who, of course, is a major character in the series, at least for these 2-ish seasons, does leave during this storyline, so it is needed to be watched. And for something that you need to watch, it's not that bad, actually. Certainly not the best historical, but definitely not the worst historical. Now that Vickie is replaced for like one story with Katarina, a character that you will forget the name of within a few seconds, Vickie now is with Troyes. So what happens to Vickie? Vickie actually lives a very happy, long life with Troyes over time. She settles down on a farm, has not just lots of kids, but also lots of grandkids, who we see her telling her tales to one of them during this little short that was shot for season 2, with Maureen O'Brien reprising her role, not just there, but also during the Tales of the TARDIS, as she meets up once again with Steven. I love to see this like older Vickie living this happy, like peaceful life. I think it's really great. In a way, she finds a new family, not just this found family with the TARDIS, as she has a newer sort of father figure with the Doctor, but then is able to find love, something that she didn't really fully understand till she met Troyes. And what's cool about Troyes is even though he's barely a character, he at least was clearly like a likable guy, and it's clear they definitely had a good relationship, of which has not been written anything negative about. So for once, all the cynical Doctor Who writers who write bad things about the companions can all piss off. Vickie has a happily ever after, and that's pretty neat. Would have been cool to see it during that story, but I guess the little send-off that they have is a pretty good send-off, all things considered. It's much better than the "okay, bye" that happens to a lot of companions. Maureen O'Brien, however, of course, also had quite the happy life, and thankfully is still with us at the time of filming. Maureen O'Brien, who P.S. is a founder of the Everyman Theatre, and worked as an assistant floor manager for the company, ultimately continued acting and would act for many years going forward. Though immediately after Doctor Who, she wouldn't find that many roles and would ultimately work as an acting teacher. She would, in the 70s, after moving to Canada and then back to the UK, find a lot of very notable roles. Was very successful in the 70s and 80s and stayed as an actor and an acting teacher for many years. As mentioned, the last actual episode that was produced by Verity Lambert was ultimately meant to be a prequel to the main storyline, The Daleks' Master Plan. Oh boy, let's talk about the Daleks' Master Plan. So personally, I'm not quite sure, even though I've tried to look it up, how exactly the allotting of episodes for certain storylines works, but it seems that basically the writers decide how many that they're going to get for this season, and then they'll just kind of go with that, with however many stories that they're going to allow. For some reason, either this producer or the previous one decided that, you know what, it's perfectly fine for you, Terry Nation, to have 12 whole episodes. In fact, 13, counting Mission to the Unknown, which of course is meant to be a prologue to the Daleks' Master Plan, as mentioned, and all that together makes for the longest storyline for the franchise. Including Mission to the Unknown, only episodes 2, 5, and 10 of the Master Plan are still existing as they were initially. Sections of 1, 3, and 4 are still around, and Mission to the Unknown was even recreated by a bunch of students in 2019, which do a pretty good job replicating what is there for the telesnaps, which of course, is most of this plot. Mission to the Unknown is being some soldiers who are attacked by some plants, who basically turn you into spiky plants, made by the Daleks, who of course have decided to team up with a whole bunch of aliens. These aliens are also very alien, because they all sound like that sort of very slow-talking alien thing that they do in the 60s for some reason. But all of them look very interesting. My favorite is the weird-looking one. Which weird-looking one? That one. The Daleks' Master Plan is a bit of an absolute mess. Split up into almost 2 halves in between episode 7, which is basically a filler Christmas episode that ultimately ends with the Doctor breaking the fourth wall, which some people say that supposedly it made the editors angry, but if it did, then they would have cut it. So that's, incorrect. But it's just odd that the Doctor talked to the audience, even if it was just for like 3 seconds. But filler is a great way to describe this storyline because a lot of it is filler. There's a lot of stuff that just happens and you just kind of go with it. The plot of it is the Daleks alongside these group of aliens are trying to just, conquer the galaxy, starting with the solar system with help of the solar system guardian Mavic Chen, who of course the whole time is this hammy absolute wacko and is the best part of the storyline. He generally believes himself to be in charge of everything, so much to the point that the Daleks are like, God, he's such an idiot. The moment that he's done, being used, we're gonna kill him. I feel like the Daleks let him get away with a little bit too much, because he just straight up, smacks one and they don't immediately kill him, but they kind of need him for a little bit. Ultimately, they have this big time destroyer bomb thing, which the Doctor basically steals the main component of it from Mavic Chen once he finds out about their weird time bomb. Now, they of course chase him throughout the galaxy, as the Doctor and friends end up taking a Dalek ship because they can't get back to the TARDIS, with, of course, help of a character who is in fact played by a very notable Doctor Who actor, Nicholas Courtney, who would later be known as the Brigadier. This is basically the beginning of his career on Doctor Who, which will last for a good number of decades. The Dr. Stephen and Katarina, who again is still here and you probably nearly forgot about her already, take that ship and ultimately have to land on a prison planet where ultimately some dirt-covered dudes that are certainly there. One ends up actually getting in somehow and takes Katarina hostage, of which, I fully believe on accident, opens up the airlock in order for both of them to die. Katarina, who was basically just introduced, dies quickly, just kind of floating out there in space. Mind you, the Daleks' master plan didn't just do that. A lot of characters introduced die very quickly. In fact, the character played by Nicholas Courtney is looking for his scientist friend in order to find out what exactly they're trying to make with this strange metal, and almost immediately does that character get murdered. Lots of characters soon die after they're introduced because this story tries to be a lot more sophisticated under this current new producer and story editor who try to make it a lot more respectable and a little bit more adult, which of course really just makes this whole season a little bit depressing, to be honest. Now Chen tries to send one of his best agents after him, with of course being space agent Sarah Kingdom, who is very quickly convinced that Mavic Chen is doing bad. Though mind you, she was never really meant to be a full replacement. She is basically the third person in the TARDIS crew for only this storyline. I don't count Sarah Kingdom as a companion because she is only in this story and this story alone, and there certainly have been other people, even in multi-parters in modern day, that we don't count as companions, even though they've been in the TARDIS, so I don't think she counts. So I certainly couldn't tell you anything about Katarina, who of course is dead here. They killed her off ultimately because they didn't want to have a character that they needed to explain things to, even though, Future Girl needed things explained to her, so what was the difference here? Thankfully, the writer of The Mythmakers was able to write out Vickie, because in fact Katarina's horrible death was almost Vickie's, and that would have sucked. Now, with help of Sarah Kingdom, they're able to escape, ultimately finding themselves back to the TARDIS, and again after episode 7, where they're on Earth in this goofy comedic episode, which, no, isn't really that funny. They're, sidetracked by the monk who tries to, lock them on a volcano, douche, and then he follows them to ancient Egypt and is partially responsible for Stephen and Sarah and him being captured, for the Doctor to ultimately give up the real piece of metal that is for the time bomb, but this allowing them to find where the Daleks' base are, and in one last little episode they're able to find a way to get inside and take the bomb for themselves. During this point, Mavic Chen is, of course, the Daleks figure out that they don't need him anymore, and due to that, tell him to get lost, as they shove him in a cage. As the Doctor and friends are trying to go through the Dalek base, they find Mavic Chen, who's like, "Release me! I'm the immortal king of the universe! You have to listen to me!" And he still doesn't take that as he's been, betrayed by the Daleks, which makes his comeuppance immediately afterwards, as the Daleks shoot him so hard to death that it just is probably the most funny thing that Terry Nation has ever written. It makes all those moments of, why did they just let him do that, fully feel worth it. I was like, finally, good for them. P.S. Where did the monk go? He kind of just left. And unfortunately, we never really see the monk ever again, and I find that very unfortunate. The monk is a very fun character, and we do see him in various forms in expanded media later on. as of course the monk is of course a Time Lord, so he does regenerate a few times. It's just odd that we never see him, like, in live action. Some, again, would have you assume that maybe he is, in fact, the same Time Lord as the Master, but I don't think so. Not only did the Doctor and the Master know each other, and the Doctor clearly didn't know the monk until meeting him the first time, but also the monk, even if he is a bad guy, is so not very much a bad guy. He's in it for himself, sure, and he's a coward, yeah, but he's not like that, he's not the Master, certainly not. I'd love to see a new version of the monk in some way, and maybe we have. I don't know. Maybe some weird reveal in the future will reveal this. I'm down. With that being said, the Daleks' master plan is an alright story. It goes on for way goddamn too long, with 13 whole episodes. There is no reason why it needed to be that long. Now listen, I love the Daleks. I love my favorite Screamy Boys in every way possible, but ultimately, God, it's just too damn long. And a bunch of it's just kind of meandering around alien planets, and with characters that don't really matter too much, and it is a little bit too depressing, with the fact that characters die too damn quickly. You never get to learn, like, too many people. Sarah King, by the end of the story, ultimately literally grabs the bomb, and they're able to get it away from the Daleks by literally activating the thing, having her slowly die while holding it, and the Daleks melt away. And awesome scene to be sure, but one that just kind of ends that character, and then we move on. Quickly though, let's get to a little bit of the characters who were introduced and also exit in this same exact little story before we continue onwards towards the next one. Starting with Katarina. She was played by Adrienne Hill, who, besides this and the soap opera 199 Park Lane, which of course was cancelled after 18 episodes, she wouldn't appear in all that much, and would kind of nearly retire from acting in the 60s. She would have a few small roles until ultimately moving into the Netherlands, ultimately working as a drama teacher in London, living a quiet life until ultimately passing away from cancer in 1997. Not much to really say about her, as she was a very private person, and there's not much really known about her life, but I at least care a little bit more about that actress than I do Katarina, who ultimately was barely a character. So barely a character that she doesn't even have her own Wikipedia page, but Sarah Kingdom does. Katarina is basically nearly at the end of my friggin' companion ranking, and she only barely counts as a companion. The monk, of course, played by Peter Butterworth, whom was a very well-known comedian and actor for mostly the Carry On film series, of course, which he had worked with a few of them with, of course, William Hartnell. As a heroic war veteran, he has lots of his own tales to be told during his illustrious military career, but ultimately it would be his acting career that he'd be most well-known for. He would act throughout the rest of his life, throughout the 60s and 70s, through multiple comedic movies, each of which are more well-known to, British audiences than American audiences, but would even have smaller roles in more worldwide releases like The First Great Train Robbery, with, of course, Sean Connery, of all people. He married impressionist Janet Brown in 1946 and had 2 children. The two would live a very long life until ultimately in 1979. Unfortunately passing away by heart attack during the filming of the previously mentioned First Great Train Robbery. An awesome and funny guy, it would have been really cool to see this character show up again at any point. And even if not played by the fantastic Peter Butterworth, it would have at least been cool to see this character return in some way. Sarah King, of course, played by Jean Marsh, who was a very well-renowned actor even during the time, and would be even more successful after her appearance on Doctor Who. You seen Return of Oz or Willow? She's in those. Still around and still acting despite a stroke in 2013, she's been a very successful actress, and for a short time was even married to Jon Pertwee. Winning multiple awards, Jean Marsh is probably one of the most known actors of the classic Doctor Who era, and certainly wouldn't have been held down by having be a permanent character in the series, and I don't think Sarah Kingdom was ever going to be a major character in Doctor Who. Weirdly, Sarah Kingdom was kind of brought back to life, in a way, in some of the audio stuff, and is still kind of around, but not really. She's been referenced various times, and that makes sense, as being one of 2 Doctor Who companions who die in the early days of Doctor Who. Something that wouldn't happen all the way up into Audric, which, means that the Doctor is at least, has a pretty good track record of companion dying over companions living. The Third Kingdom storylines, from my understanding, are actually pretty good and kind of give you a better showing of who she was as a character, with, yes, Jean Marsh actually reprising the roles several times throughout the years. Let's just kind of suffice it to say, the Daleks' master plan has too much going on to it, and though it's fun to see the Daleks, it's kind of not worth watching this one. With the fact that a lot of it is missing and it goes on for too damn long, the Daleks' Master Plan, I feel, is one of the weakest Dalek storylines there is, and one that I do feel like is one that you probably should just skip right over. Listen, you'll forget Katarina, which of course I nearly forgot again, and Sarah Kingdom isn't really, there that much anyway, so honestly you could just pretend that Katarina just got out of the TARDIS soon afterwards, and you can move on to the Massacre. The Massacre. The Massacre, a 4-part story, is probably one of the most missing out of all of Doctor Who. There are barely any telesnaps that actually exist in The Massacre, so ultimately it's a very hard story to even watch. It's the continuing of this sophistication part of the franchise that this producer really wants to make it seem more adult, and which, is all about more important stuff, like the people behind the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre talking about how many people they're going to bring in, making those scenes of those people that have nothing to do with the two actual characters people are here to see go on way longer than they should. The Massacre is 4 whole episodes of Stephen kind of wandering a town, not really knowing about the general horrible time that was the whole Catholics and Protestants really, really, really not liking each other, and going through a lot of emotional turmoil, especially when one of the people who are involved in this is a character who is also played by William Hartnell, who he thinks is the Doctor for a bit before that character just up and dies. That character, the Deacon, will ultimately existed because William Hartnell really wanted to play a bad guy, and boy, does he sure play the Doctor again, but slower. But really, the main person behind all of this is, of course, Stephen Taylor. Being that Stephen is, of course, the main character of this is, of course, Peter Purves' favorite story, because of course it is. It unfortunately is very boring, and I couldn't give a single shit about most of what happens in The Massacre. I love how it does try to portray the environment and its mood. It's got a great setting, it's got great props and sets, but also it's just very slow, and could have easily been like 2 episodes. Or 1 in modern day. Hell, you don't even understand the premise till the Doctor's like, what day is it? Oh, let's not be here for that. Which, P.S., the Doctor isn't part of the plot, he's just off-screen doing something till the last episode. So there's basically no Doctor, and in certain scenes there's barely any Stephen, so God's sakes, it's no wonder that the friggin' viewership started dropping drastically during this episode. Stephen's own story, The Massacre, is an okay story, written by John Luca Rotti, but rewritten so much to the point that it basically wasn't even his story by the end of it. Is a story that tries its best to try to stay accurate to its time period, but never really is able to grip the audience while you're actually watching it. Which again, at this point you barely can, thus the reason why The Massacre is a good story to just kind of skip over. At least it would be. As nothing happens for a good majority of it, the only really parts that matter is by the end. Finding out that this is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the Doctor basically doesn't allow the girl that Stephen had met during the storyline, Anne Chaplet, who is of course part of the many Huguenots that are about to be absolutely massacred during the mentioned massacre, is just kind of left to her fate of whatever that might happen, even though Stephen's like, hey, we saved Katarina before, and the Doctor basically stands true in all of this. I do like the moment, as ultimately it's a good showing of the Doctor has slowly changed over time. In fact, a lot of Season 3 is a really good showing of the fact that the Doctor is subtly changing over time. A man who is way more stern in his beliefs in the past is now regretting the fact that he has to do this kind of thing, at least he feels that he does, and is especially still mourning the loss of someone that he tried to help before after he brought them from their near destruction in the Trojan War, with her still dying anyway. But it's one of those very important turning moments of the Doctor, of him beginning to still not be sure what he needs to do, or if he's even the right kind of person to do anything during his travels. What right does he have to even tempt the changing of fate by allowing someone back into his TARDIS? And it's something that actually causes a entirely rightful argument from Stephen to the Doctor, which results in this great emotional scene between the two. It's probably the best and most interesting part of the massacre, and it's one of those scenes that I think is worth looking into. A great showing of both of the actors' genuinely great ability to show emotion through these characters, and one that really almost makes the massacre worthwhile. Almost, mostly because the massacre again is pretty boring through most of it, and also the moment that happens immediately afterwards. They land in seemingly modern-day Earth, which Stephen almost leaves the TARDIS before running back in very quickly and being like, we gotta leave, for reasons that aren't really fully explained, in which they're randomly interrupted by a girl who just walks onto the TARDIS and is now part of the group, that being Dodo. Dodo Chaplet, who they're like, wait, she might be related to Anne. And they're like, maybe she did survive, Doctor. Now we're perfectly fine with each other again. And I feel like regardless of Dodo being Dodo, it's probably another important moment of the Doctor beginning to realize that maybe there is good in trying to help people. Anyway, now we have Dodo. Dodo will be a major character for the rest of the season, played by Jackie Lane, an actress who in fact tried to audition for the role of Susan all the way at the start 2 years ago, of which when the producer found her just kind of out in the open, he didn't even know that. It was like, you know what, come on board. So the previous script editor and producer would ultimately stay on more or less for the next story, ultimately to kind of hand it off towards the next script editor and producer. Thus, more or less together, they created the arc. Script editor Jerry Davis was more or less behind the arc and helped out make the crazy sci-fi idea and brought on Michael Emerson to help film the 4 parts of the arc, all of which still survive today. This is very interesting due to the fact that Michael Emerson, who of course was doing the innovative and thought very odd way of shooting out of order, was ultimately fired before doing so. Working with these new people is the reason why Peter Purves, who was about to leave the series, decided to stay on for a teeny bit longer. And that's great. It's cool to see more Stephen, especially in this one. An arc, a sort of like 2-part story through 4 episodes, is in basically 2 smaller stories separated by this line of mediocrity. The arc's first 2 episodes are their own story, with them finding this generational ship. A lot of the humans that are coming from the destroyed many years ago Earth, the one that, you know, later on we'll see be exploded by the sun, are on this ship, with most of the human beings that are still surviving being shrunken down in order to be, like, grown back up when they get to the planet that they're all heading to. While the ones that are still on board will ultimately have children that will continue to run the ship over the next 700-something years, that of course called the Guardians. They're currently working with the Monoids, this weird one-eye species of green aliens, who of course are people with ping pong balls in their mouths. They don't talk and they speak through sign language, and they're pretty funny and I like them. Unfortunately, Dodo has the sniffles, and considering that this is a, like, futuristic big spaceship, they certainly will have the cure for the common cold, but they don't, because a lot of that research was lost in the destruction of Earth. So unfortunately, we get the whole, you did this on purpose, kangaroo court kind of thing, which, you know, though I don't like in Doctor Who, doesn't last too long, as thankfully there is a voice of reason in the actual leader of the Guardians who was like, let them make the fucking cure, and thankfully after they do, the guy who was like part of this nearly witch hunt that tried to kill our main trio apologizes. An interesting sci-fi plot, some actually likable characters that have an actual arc, even if it is a quicker one, and sensible, smart writing. Also, some genuinely great and interesting camera work, which feels a lot more modern than the very, like, static way a lot of the early Doctor Who stuff is shot. This is a very well-constructed plot and story, and that's what makes this half of the arc very good, actually. Its premise is just so interesting, and the aliens that are with them are just so odd that you really want to see what's going to happen next. But of course, if you didn't know by the end of this plot, which it seemingly ends by the 2nd episode, then you're very surprised by the sudden twist that is the arc part 3, where this, like, unfinished statue is revealed to be finished as the TARDIS finds itself 700 years in the future on the same ship, with that statue now being of a monoid. A fantastic twist and cliffhanger leads into this 2-part storyline of the rest of the arc, which is just kind of dumb. The monoids, who now have a necklace that allows them to speak, have basically taken over humans. They believe themselves to have been slaves to the humans, and now that they've taken over, they've basically began to be violent and more incompetent, as they basically nearly kill themselves by shooting at each other. I don't know what this story is trying to imply, but if it is trying to imply anything, it might be a bit problematic. Regardless, the monoids are incredibly incompetent, and in fact so much to the point that it is incredibly comedic. It is not very hard to immediately overthrow them, especially because when they finally get to the planet that they've been waiting for, there's invisible people there. That's the second time there's been invisible things in this season, and I hope it's not for a while again, because I don't like the concept. The second half of the arc really brings it down, personally. It's a fun storyline, but not for the same reasons the first half of the arc is. It becomes, goofy, wacky sci-fi stuff in the middle of it. That's really just fun because of weird aliens and certain scenes that just are unintentionally funny. That being said, Dodo and Steven are a big help towards the Doctor in order to figure out what kind of plan that they're going to set up in order to have the humans be inspired to fight back against their evil alien captors, but also to inspire both parties to find a way to find actual equality and live in peace, not just with each other, but the weird invisible people who are probably already standing in your room watching you change. The arc is another fun storyline that I absolutely do recommend. It's Dodo's little first adventure, even though she's wearing the, goofiest friggin' costume ever, because it was still the original producer, and they wouldn't let her wear a miniskirt. After a multitude of episodes just kind of being very depressing, and being a lot about, death, it's a nice little, turn of pace. And plus, with the fact that it just feels very modern and very strange and sci-fi, with it clearly being written by someone who really cares about science fiction. Current script editor was a big fan of H.G. Wells to the point that he was in a club about H.G. Wells. Clearly there's a lot of inspiration coming from that, and you can really feel that in the arc. It's a very fun storyline that, even if definitely imperfect, is one I absolutely recommend as a really good showing of what this era of Doctor Who was like. It is clear that whether it be through the multiple storylines or just especially the arc, that the budget went a little bit over. So ultimately, now fully under new producer Inez Lloyd, him and Jerry Davis were going to begin making this new part of the franchise that would be a lot more sci-fi and a lot more fun. Ultimately, they had to finish off the plots that were already commissioned, so of course they made a little bit of changes to what was already going to be the Celestial Toymaker. The Celestial Toymaker is, of course, played by Michael Gough, a very well-known actor from a multitude of films, both American and British, some of which you may know, and the fact that he, of course, was Alfred during the 90s Batman films. He does a great job as this mysterious and fun major villain who ultimately has crazy psychic powers and brings toys to life to basically force people to be his playthings. It is entirely possible that the toys in this storyline are people who had lost previous games and are now his new playthings. A horrible prospect, which is entirely horrifying, and the reason why it's, you really want to get out of his weird games. However, the story doesn't go too far with it, as it would have been a lot more interesting to be like, oh, you don't want to end up like them. But they just kind of end up being weird little people that Dodo and Steven have to just beat in like hopscotch. The Doctor, who of course was written to be invisible for most of it because the previous script editor and producer were spiteful and didn't like William Hartnell and were about to write him out, ends up now being used to give William Hartnell like a little vacation throughout the storyline. So it is mostly Dodo and Steven jumping around through some wacky characters, of which get a little bit annoying at times, especially because most of this is missing, with the Celestial Toymaker just kind of making fun of the Doctor's moving hand as he's playing a game that I don't understand at all. Yes, you see, Doctor, they're busy playing Chutes and Ladders. If they fail, then maybe they'll become my toys themselves, Doctor. Now continue to play your own board game. Isn't this fun? The answer is not really. I love the Celestial Toymaker, and Michael Gough does a great job as the character, but that's it. That's it. That's literally what I just described was it for 4 whole episodes until finally they get to the actual TARDIS after 3 episodes of finding a fake one, where the Doctor just kind of ends his game through throwing his voice and somehow it being the Toymaker's voice, and thus beating the game and collapsing the Toymaker's world in on himself. I find the storyline kind of just dull, right? I don't like it all that much. That might be like a little bit of a hot take for a storyline that is very well renowned and well known for the like whole entirety of the fan base, but I don't see it. I'm sorry, right? I like the idea of characters like Q and the Celestial Toymaker and them playing with mortals and us not fully understanding them, but I've seen the idea done so much better. I've seen it done worse, and both of those are in Star Trek, right? The Celestial Toymaker, I feel like, is just a fine storyline. Nothing wrong with it, but nothing, like, spectacular about it. I get why people like the character. The actor is great, the character idea is cool, but that's it. The actual storyline itself, I don't think was actually done well, and it probably would have been worse had it been under the original producer and scriptwriter, and I feel like they did the best they possibly could to try and fix it. Michael Gough would in fact play the character a multitude of times throughout the years, as he would continue on, being vaguely associated with the franchise. It would have been cool to see those actually, like, in live action, and him returning in the same way he did in audio form against the Sixth Doctor would have been pretty cool. Michael Gough, again, would be a very well-renowned actor and would work all the way up until 1999, where after Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, he ultimately would retire. It's cool that we have brought back this character, whether or not played by Michael Gough, as he has had a few different faces throughout the years, most notably recently, Neil Patrick Harris. Of course, another story for a much longer time from now, when we eventually get to the friggin' 15th Doctor. One note I should take before moving on is the fact that the Celestial Toymaker has, as mentioned, one only surviving episode, which is the very last of which, in which said episode actually needed to have an announcement for the copyright of one of the characters that it had, because they vaguely implied that it's another weird British kid character, and I'm not quite sure what kind of what idea that they were going for, but it's just sort of funny that they're like, whoop, maybe I'm a copyright character, uh-oh. Another one where all episodes remain is The Gunfighters, written by the same guy that did The Mythmakers. The producers wanted him to have a little fun, so of course he decided to make a Western. Now let me just tell you, I'm more of a Clint Eastwood guy than I am a John Wayne guy, so I couldn't really care too much about Westerns of this period. It's not anything depressing or boring or slow, but it's also still kind of boring and still kind of slow, as it goes 4 episodes too goddamn long. They're of course in the middle of the events of the shootout at the OK Corral, of which some people are tricked to believe that the Doctor and his group are Doc Holliday, and they're about to get in the gunfight instead. I both A, have seen this before and better, and B, don't care too much. A lot of the Gunfighters is just kind of a lot of meandering around. The first episode's fun because it has the characters clearly having a lot of fun, despite Peter Purves not admitting the fact that he was clearly having fun in these scenes. And it's almost like a comedy, but then it quickly becomes just like a Western, and then I'm just bored. Now, not too much to say about the Gunfighters. It is another story where they are certainly in a period of history where they barely have anything to do. At least the Doctor gets his tooth pulled out. What happened to that tooth afterwards? If you went back to this period of time and you took that tooth, could you, clone a Time Lord? Besides certain funny moments, a lot of the Gunfighters is pretty forgettable. It is definitely one that I would actually recommend skipping. Mostly because it wouldn't be that bad of a story if it weren't for the, exposition singing narrator lady, who by the 3rd episode becomes incredible. Love the cowboy outfits, though. Now we get to Peter Purves' last story, The Savages. Finally agreeing to stay up into a certain storyline, Peter Purves was quickly written off by the end of the storyline, something that they nearly forget towards the conclusion. The Savages is another one of the stories where all of it is missing, and it's very missing. These possible immortals, who apparently know a lot about the Doctor, try to hide the fact that they've basically been sucking the life energy off of who they call the Savages, who are people who definitely are sentient enough to be their own people. Stephen and Dodo separate from the Doctor as the Doctor gets his own life essence sucked out and put into one of these immortals, who starts acting like the first Doctor / William Hartnell, and it was actually coached by William Hartnell to do so, which is very funny. And Stephen and Dodo help out these Savages with Stephen thought as a god almost, and eventually he's like, okay, calm down. They're able to get into the big base of these brain-sucking guys and literally destroy their technology, and then they basically are like, well, now we have to work together, to which the leader of the Savages are like, then we'll have Stephen lead us, because he's the best leader there could possibly be. And the Doctor's quickly like, yes, Stephen, You're the best leader they could possibly have. It's a nice little moment between the two, and it really shows you how much the Doctor not only has changed, as he really tries to be a much better, like, guidance figure for his companions to be like, here's some actual, like, good advice, and, I think you have grown as a person and you can absolutely do it. But it's also a good showing for Steven, who really gets a lot of good moments in this storyline and has a nice little ending of, hey, now I can really find a purpose in life. Starting from this guy who was jailed by a bunch of, like, Christmas tree ornaments, now he's found, like, a new purpose in life and something to really do, right? And I think it makes sense for his character. After seeing a lot of people die from this just, like, horrible intolerance from all the way back in the past, he now sees that he can actually do a lot of good at changing the viewpoints of people to a more positive way. Steven exits, and so does Peter Purves, with now there being another little bit of let's talk about what happens to both the actor and character once again in this video. Steven would stay as the Savages as their king and would actually have multiple children, one of which is named Dodo, so that's pretty nice. Because, of course, Doctor Who writers are very, very the way they are, she is actually killed, which inspires one of the other daughters to literally take over in a coup. It's its whole own story, but inevitably Steven does begin to help out leading the Savages once again, weirdly with the Doctor's, like, brain essence in, like, a computer. A weird story that I think is actually worth reading and is maybe canon. Either way, we do see Steven in Tales of the TARDIS being perfectly fine, living a very long life, and even meeting up with Vickie, as mentioned before. I think Peter Purves just does a great job really just making this character a likable, fun guy who's just like a regular dude, who just is here to have fun adventures and learn about the world around him. It would have been cool to see more of him, but then that would have been more tales of how much Peter Purves doesn't like the episodes that he isn't the main character in. Speaking of which, Peter Purves ultimately did have a very long career after Doctor Who, not only reappearing multiple times as the Doctor and other characters throughout multiple Doctor Who stuff, whether it be video or audio, he would more majorly be the regular presenter on Blue Peter. Now, as a not Britain person, I couldn't tell you much besides that it was 67 to 78, and it was the main thing he was known for, which actually allowed him to show multiple clips from the show because people still knew him from Doctor Who as well. Though he would ultimately not be in that show after the 70s, he would ultimately actually be more majorly known to some people, as he has a 40-year association with dog shows, and you know what? Good for him. By this point in the series, they basically stopped doing this thing they had been doing since the beginning, which is giving every episode a title, and then it was just the Gunfighters 1, 2, 3, and 4 going forward. Same thing went with the Savages, and same thing goes for the War Machines, which only it and the Cybermen are one of a few during the whole franchise with a slightly different opening. Has the Doctor and Dodo returned back to modern day, which is basically kind of being the end point of what the series was going to lead to with the original cast. Whether it be when they picked up Dodo or when they'll basically drop off Dodo, though that's a bit of a spoiler, isn't it? The Doctor returning to modern day is very interesting, as the Doctor had been trying to do so for such a long time that to see it finally happen really feels like a big turning point in the series. Though the Doctor still quite isn't able to control the TARDIS quite yet, we are able to see more modern day stuff and a little bit more of a different kind of feel for the series. The War Machines is the first really good showing of what Doctor Who would fully be going forward. A lot more fun, pulpy, sci-fi stuff, and that's very clearly the case, as ultimately they brought along the unofficial science advisor known as Kid Peddler, who ultimately would actually come up with the idea of the evil computer, but of course being Wotan, or as is called Votan by most people for some reason. The computer that makes no mistakes makes the biggest mistake by doing literally anything. They were going to hook it up to basically every computer ever, and through that it was probably going to be able to control everything ever, as even being connected to a phone line allows it to basically hypnotize people who pick up that phone. Not only could a robot basically call multiple people at once, probably most people in Britain, but especially if it had the computer power of every computer ever. Of course, instead it decides to build a tank through some of the people that it decides to, of course, mind control. Nearly trying to do so with the Doctor, it then controls Dodo to then try to bring the Doctor to Wotan, which of course the Doctor quickly hypnotizes Dodo to just kind of have her go to sleep so that she can't be controlled by Wotan anymore. That is the last time we see Dodo in live action ever. Jackie Lane, who was about to leave anyway, of course, just kind of leaves right then and there and isn't seen the rest of the story. So who is? This being the 60s, of course, the now current producer and script editor wanted to have some more hip teens for the teen crowd to get them involved, which I guess helped, sure. So then we get Ben and Polly. Ben and Polly are, of course, a duo of characters who ultimately are introduced at the same time and we'll probably talk about in the same breath. One is your pretty typical country bumpkin who just wants to serve his country in the Navy. The other one is a hip, wacky teen who wants to have fun all the time. They have a great dynamic and they have a lot of great chemistry on screen, and you could really feel that throughout the scenes that they are in there together. Ultimately, Polly isn't really important through most of it, as she is, of course, working with the guy who developed Wotan, and thus she's one of the people who get hypnotized very quickly. But it is weirdly through a connection with Ben that she almost begins to fight against the control, but that's never really important at all. Ben, however, isn't hypnotized and actually begins to help the Doctor and the military fight against this singular, quote, war machine, which of course kills people by sending death smoke at them. As soon enough, they reprogram the war machine to go blow Wotan, which it weirdly does. It gets into the multi-floor building, of which I believe Wotan was at the top floor, and shoots Wotan. Did it take the friggin' elevator? Or the stairs? How did it get up there? Either way, it does. Wotan explodes, and it's never important ever again. Except in certain audios, because of course it is. At least that time it made better looking robots. And it was Torchwood? Just kind of goes back to the TARDIS and waits for Dodo, only to then be told by Ben and Polly that she sends her wishes and is going to stay in modern day. In being very suspicious about this strange old man who did help them against a weird, crazy robot thing, they decided to follow him in the police box, which, considering modern day, they just believe it as a police box, to then, of course, see that it is a time machine, and now they, as other companions had, are now brought along on accident. Notably, this apparently is the in-universe reason why exactly UNIT is founded, in order to deal with weird threats such as this. We'll certainly talk about that group later on in the series, and of course another character played by Nicholas Courtney who will be very important once that character shows up in the second Doctor period. But more importantly, Dodo and Jackie Lane. Dodo does not live a good life. Supposedly because of, Wotan's weird hypnotizing thing, she slowly goes mad and dies in a friggin' insane asylum, as mentioned by the very, 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 very cynical ass books that are made by the weird, cynical Doctor Who writers. I hate that people just kind of mess with Dodo, and though it's implied in other media that she might be still living a perfectly normal life, it's not like Jackie Lane would have ever returned to really reprise the character for us to have any kind of fun cameo from her. So thus it's kind of just up in the air of whatever writer really decides what Dodo wants to be, and I hate that people decide that she dies. She just fucked off and dies? Like, what? Dodo wasn't that interesting of a character, and she certainly, nearly killed a whole race with the sniffles, but despite that fact, and the fact that she never really did anything to be helpful, and just kind of stood there and screamed, and just looked like a bit of a goofball, she's not a bad character. I thought she was kind of funny in places, and she certainly is not the top of my companion ranking, but, I think Dodo, needs more respect put on her name than just she goes crazy and dies. That sucks. As mentioned, Jackie Lane would not really be part of this franchise for a lot of her life. Besides stuff that involves charity work, she would never really try to be involved with Doctor Who at all. It's clear she didn't really like her time in Doctor Who from how quickly she wanted to leave the series. After leaving Doctor Who, she fell out of love with acting after being typecasted as Dodo-like characters, which she ultimately left to work for an antique company for 6 years before actually setting up her own voiceover agency, AdVoice, representing people like Tom Baker, Janet Fielding, Nicholas Courtney. She lived a very quiet, reserved life and would never really have too much to do with acting, at least out there in the public, which, you know what? Good for her. You live the life that you want to live because you want to live it, and that's the kind of life that inspires me. Jackie Lane would live all the way up until June 7th, 2021, passing away at the age of 79. And thus we come to the end of Season 3 of Doctor Who. This was a very tumultuous season, and a lot of it was very slow. I don't like a lot of Season 3, but what was there, which was enjoyable, was very enjoyable. By the end of Season 3, it becomes clear that they begin to really figure out what Doctor Who needs to be. Unfortunately, it was during this very, very growing pains of the series, right? And that's really the case for a lot of the first Doctor, but especially of Season 3. A season of a lot of depressing storylines in between two pulpy storylines that are of two entirely different groups of people because of the constant changing of actors and producers and writing staff. It just becomes this mess of a season, which when you know about a lot of the stuff that was happening backstage, it becomes a lot more clear. A lot of this is a lot of stuff that I think you could just genuinely skip, unless it's the parts that you have to watch because it's an exit of a companion or the entrance of a companion. Of course, I think if you're willing to just read a little bit, then, you know, maybe you can just kind of read about the massacre and be like, oh, that's how they found Dodo, and then watch the War Machines, which is fun, and then, you know, then there's Ben and Polly, and then you can move on to season 4, you know? A lot of this you can just sort of move on over, because a lot of it doesn't really just leave that much of an actual impact, I'm sorry. Not nothing though, there is good parts to the season, parts that are worth watching, but as with most of the first Doctor stuff, it is the growing pains of the series, and it's stuff that just I didn't want to go back to. Season 2 and 3's reviews really took me longer than they probably should have, because these seasons are a bit of a slog to get through, but I'm glad I'm finally over and done with them, right? It was fun to revisit certain storylines that I really did enjoy. I'm looking forward to the ending of the William Hartnell era, which is what we'll be doing next time in its own separate video before getting into season 4 and the beginning of the Patrick Troughton era. Until then, I've been the Movie-a-thoner. If you want to see me review anything else in particular, then leave that stuff in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe to see what else I'll be doing in the future. And most importantly, stay good, stay safe, and don't be an asshole.